Phil Twyford.
Your guidance, as always, appreciated.
Yeah, except you don't comment on ruling. That member must learn that.
Okay, point taken. Sarah, I wanted to make some comments about, in part 2, sections 50E and 50F and 50L. Those are the sections I want to comment on. One of the two main objections that Labor has to this bill is that while it enables a policy that we fundamentally disagree with, we also object to it on the basis that it is, as we have already said, a charter for corruption. It gives unfettered powers to two ministers to dispose of any way they see fit billions of dollars of taxpayer-owned assets, of land and housing. And I want to refer members and any listeners to this debate to section 50E in part 2, which says that the minister may enter into transfer contracts as the corporation or the subsidiary. So the designated ministers, acting as if they were the corporation, may enter into transfer contracts or contracts for sale, that is. And subsection 2 reads, a transfer contract may be on any terms and conditions, including as to consideration that the minister may agree with the transferee. This is unbelievable. We're talking about billions of dollars of land and housing owned by the people of New Zealand. The national government are in the process of giving Bill English and Paula Bennett the power to dispose of these publicly owned assets on any terms and conditions they see fit, including as to consideration, and that means that they can do a deal on any basis. So if they are desperate to hock off assets to some PPP company, to some private investors, they can do any deal about the amount of money that changes hands, the subsidies the government's going to pay them, the payback period. They can bankroll them into the deal. You name it, all the options are there. And you know why they're doing that? They're doing it because they are desperate to be able to flog off these incredibly valuable public assets in any way they see fit. They don't care about the need to deliver value for the taxpayer. They don't care about stewardship of assets that generations of taxpayers and State House tenants have paid off. They want the ability to do deals with their mates. And as I said, that is a charter for corruption. There is a reason that we have the provisions in the Public Finance Act. There is a reason that ministers are governed by a raft of legislative provisions that govern and control and put limits around and hold them accountable in the work that they do as ministers, particularly when they're doing commercial deals with publicly owned assets. Now, we've already had the spectacle in the new year of New Zealand slipping down the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. As reported by the New Zealand Herald, the 2015 Corruption Perceptions Index, released by Transparency International, points to the Orovida affair, the Saudi sheep deal, and Sky City Convention affair as reasons for New Zealand's slide down the rankings. And Mr. Chairman, these provisions, 50F, 50G and 50L, illustrate my point. They give carte blanche to the ministers. They are unfettered powers that give these two ministers the freedom to make any kind of deal they want with billions of dollars of publicly owned assets. And I don't even see a raised eyebrow on the other side of the House. They don't seem to think this is a problem. They are quite happy to see two of their members disposing of these hugely valuable public assets with no controls and no accountability. If you look at 50G, it has a provision in a similar light. The minister may do other things as the corporation or subsidiary relating to and to implement social housing transactions. It says that the Minister, Mr Chairman, it says that the Minister may, for and on behalf of the corporation, do anything the Minister considers necessary or desirable in relation to the negotiation of or entry or potential entry into a transfer contract or a transitional services contract. I mean, really, folks, it could not be clearer that these ministers are being given a free pass to do any kind of deal they like with their cabinet club mates, with any PPP firms, you name it. And I think it's a shocking and appalling abdication of the government's responsibility to steward public resources in the interests of the nation and the public good. We've had some debate already this evening about what will happen to the proceeds of the houses that are sold. And Nick Smith, former Minister responsible for state housing, really, I think, really sold us a pup in he tried to convey the idea that actually the proceeds of the sale of the houses would be reinvested back into Housing New Zealand. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And I make that point because, Nick Smith also tried to make the point that there will be transparency in this whole process because after the sale is made, they're going to have to publish something, a notice in the Gazette. Now, if you look at 50L, it says, the Minister must, as soon as practicable after a social housing transaction is settled, publish a notice in the Gazette describing the general nature of the social housing transaction. Describe the general nature of the housing transaction. Well, that's not transparency. That's not accountability. My goodness. All they need to do is say, well, we've sold a few houses in Invercargill to an Australian company. They don't need to say what the valuation of the properties were. They don't need to say how it was financed. They don't need to say what they were sold for. They don't need to say what's going to happen to the proceeds. So this is the most pathetic kind of effort at providing any kind of transparency and accountability. And to correct, I think, the mistaken statements uttered in this House before the break by the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith, this bill is very, very clear, and it says that once land is declared to be social housing land for the purposes of disposal under this bill, then the proceeds of that sale will go into a Crown account. It does not say go back into Housing New Zealand. It does not say that these funds will be then reinvested in the provision of state or social housing. And in fact, repeatedly, national government ministers have declined to give that assurance. They've been asked in the media and in this House whether or not the sale proceeds would be reinvested in state housing, and they've refused to do that. So my point, Mr. Chairman, is that if you take into account the provisions in 50L, which is the best that this bill can offer in terms of transparency, all it is a very insubstantial attempt at telling the public what's happened, but there is no rigour, there is no detail. People, in all likelihood, people will have no idea about the substance of what has happened when large quantities of volumes of publicly owned assets are sold into what could well be private ownership. So my point, Mr. Chairman, is that when you take into account these provisions in Chapter 2, there's no accountability, there's no transparency. The ministers are given huge, wide-ranging powers to do whatever they like. It is a charter for corruption. It will cast the ministers involved. It will put them in a very vulnerable situation if they're seen to be doing deals with private interests who will benefit from these deals. And with the Honourable Bill English talking in the last couple of days about large amounts of state housing being sold off to international funds so that they can operate on a business model like the retirement village companies do, I think there's a real risk that these deals will besmirch further the reputation that New Zealand has for probity and integrity.